Hello, and welcome to Mental Health Matters Podcast. I'm your host, Liz Lang, and I'm here with Dr. Mark Burton. In this podcast, we will talk about all things mental health. Thank you so much for joining us. Hey guys, Liz Lang here with Dr. Mark Burton, and this week we're going to get into isolation. And I kind of mentioned last week why it's taken me so long to get to this topic. I think it's because I have maybe some unresolved trauma.
What is your trauma, Liz?
Oh, the pandemic was horrible for me. I mean, because I'm an extrovert and it was so emotionally painful to be isolated like that. And then moving to Indiana certainly didn't help. It was really hard. And when we first started doing this podcast, I thought, well, maybe we could do a topic on that. And then I thought, no, it's not going to be relevant because the pandemic is almost over. And then it wasn't almost over. So anyways, but, I think there are reasons outside of a pandemic that people can be isolated. And so I think it's important to talk about isolation. We are going to get into the effects of the pandemic and isolation kind of surrounding that. But, in this day and age, well, in today's world, post-pandemic, a lot of people work from home.
Right.
And isolation can be a problem with that. And so this is an important topic to talk about.
When you and I were discussing, if we would do this, I think I had just had a client and I hadn't realized that the negative effect that was still going on. I mean, I knew it, during the height of the pandemic, it was pretty easy to see. But again, things have really loosened up quite a bit. And a woman came in who was working from home and she found it very difficult or almost impossible to leave the house.
Yeah.
And so, once you become isolated, for some people, this doesn't happen for everyone, certainly, but she then became fearful of leaving the house. And so that fear generalized. So I understand if you're a little apprehensive about, getting the virus, but if you don't push yourself to go back out, then the fear gets bigger. I think we've talked about how, if you stay away from fears or they can get really big. And I think that's probably happened for some people. And so they remain isolated.
Yeah. Well, and so isolation can genuinely be damaging to human beings.
Mm-hmm.
We are social creatures. We are not meant to be isolated. Now, some people like more human interaction than others. And so that's not what we're talking about. There are people who I guess you might kind of call them a hermit. They like to be alone. They like their peace. They like their quiet. Even those people who seem to be hermits, they still need socialization. Everybody needs it.
Well, we should talk about the difference between isolation and loneliness because they're different. So if you're isolated for whatever reason, then you can also be lonely. But if you choose to be isolated, you may not be lonely.
Okay.
If it's a choice and there aren't any negative effects, so you're talking about the hermit, that they choose to live in the cave and they're okay with it and they're okay not seeing people very often. You can also be lonely and not be isolated. So, for instance, you can be in a group of people. I mean, I see people all the time who have some sort of social anxiety. They can be in the middle of the people and they pull back and they feel really lonely. Or you can be in a marriage. I see this all the time. You can be in a marriage and feel lonely because you don't have that connection. So I think, as you said a few minutes ago, being social creatures, we need that emotional connection. Well, you can be around people and not have that emotional connection.
Okay, that's a good point. Yeah.
Yeah. So the isolation, you talked about there are certainly mental health effects, increased anxiety, increased depression, higher rates of suicide. But here's one. I ran into this a couple of different places, and I don't know how they came up with this, but so I don't know that I put too much stock in this number I'm going to give you, but it just shows that there are big physiological effects. It says one study described the effects of a lack of social connection as being comparable to smoking 15 cigarettes a day.
Wow.
I think it just gives you an idea of how damaging it can be on our. So going back to the two part, you can choose to be isolated. And some I mean, I guess in the extreme, an extrovert or an introvert may choose to be more isolated and be okay with it. I think I told you this before. I was so prepared for the pandemic because I am an introvert, and I thought this is great.
Mm-hmm.
I quite liked it, and I loved. I still went out. In fact, I never quit going to the office. Myself, Lindy, and our daughter Adrian. The others did not come into the office. The
Mm-hmm.
others in our group, we never quit, and we were always there. And I just always felt safe. I loved going to Costco with my mask on and my sunglasses and my hat. I thought that was the greatest thing for me.
I can go
So
incognito
yes.
everywhere.
Yeah. But so for some people, isolation is not as damaging. But then, I still have a lot of strong relationships. And so mental health wise, it's damaging. So if you are not necessarily choosing to be isolated, I think that's an important thing that
Yeah.
some people are isolated. Maybe they have to live in a place out in the country that is isolated, which those places certainly exist throughout the world. They exist in
Mm-hmm.
our country. They exist in the state of Utah, where you're
Yep.
out living for whatever reason. And so that I think is hard, that type of isolation. Certainly the pandemic was very hard for a lot of people because of that, what they thought was forced isolation. But again, 15 cigarettes a day, what it's saying is it decreases your lifespan
Yeah.
considerably.
Well, and so because we know that relationships are what make us happy,
Right.
and
Right.
and connecting to people, and consider how hard it is to connect with someone if you can't see them on a regular basis. And you certainly can. In fact, it's been almost 3 years now since I moved from Utah to Indiana, and I have a friend who I've remained very, very close with. We've been able to maintain that connection, despite the distance. But it's harder to certainly form new connections, right? And,
Mhm.
it can be hard to maintain old ones. I mean, and I also think of my parents who I still have a very strong connection with, right? And that I still feel very close to, even though they live even farther away. They live in Washington State and I'm over in Indiana. But I think really when isolation becomes dangerous is when there's a lack of connection, right? And that's if you don't have enough connection. And so maybe that's really what it comes down to is connection is the key. If you're missing that, then it's just it's not good. This isn't actually true, but I guess in a way I have this thought of more people means more years in your life, right? The more people you have, the longer you're going to live, which isn't necessarily
Well,
true.
well, I think there are other factors, but
Yes.
it is an important factor. I mean,
Yeah.
one of the studies indicated 30% chance of an early death, increased risk of early death if you're socially isolated without those connections. So, yeah, it has profound physical effect, which
Hmm.
means the opposite is true, which
Yeah.
is, if you have good connections. And I think it's important for listeners to understand it's not like you need a whole group of friends. You need one
Yeah.
or two really good, connections with other people, and that's really good enough. I mean, a
Hmm.
lot of people are really good. Extroverts typically are really good at, maintaining friendships, and introverts typically are not. I'm not that great at maintaining friendships. So my
So,
daughter Adrian, who you've
mhm.
heard on this podcast, is a real extrovert. She does an amazing job of maintaining her friendships in fact, she's leaving tomorrow to go spend the weekend with high school friends. So,
Oh wow, that's impressive.
yeah.
I mean, I don't think I'm not I'm an extrovert and I'm not close with anybody from high school.
Yeah.
So it's not that I wouldn't want to see them. I mean, there's certainly people that I went to high school with that if I go back to Washington, I try to see. But I mean, I don't know that I would go away to spend a weekend. I mean, I guess if we
Well,
lived
it
in the
takes
same
effort.
state.
It
Yeah,
takes effort. Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
So,
yeah, absolutely. And so I think it's also important to maybe kind of at least talk about how isolation can look different for everybody.
right.
So, you could be, I mean, like certainly during the pandemic, there was a lot of people who were isolated. But Mark, you said you didn't feel isolated at all.
I didn't. But again, for me, I didn't work from home. I
Yeah.
never did. In the whole, however long we want to say the pandemic went on. And, in some states, and I think this is true for Utah, they were saying I think they used the term lockdown. Does that
Yeah.
sound familiar?
Yep, it was
And
lockdown.
and so being a mental health provider, we were not under those restrictions at all.
Yes.
We were like a healthcare provider. And so I always chose to go into work, and anybody who wanted to come in, I saw them in the office, and we were careful. And I certainly never got COVID until way after that. So I was fine with it was a little more isolating, but I was fine with that. But I still got out. I still went to
Hmm.
the store. I didn't, a lot of people quit going to the store. They had food and groceries delivered. We never stopped doing that. The neighbors across the street, I know they isolated from their family, from their extended family. And a lot of people did that.
Hmm.
I heard stories of grandparents who, I think there was a lot of misinformation that was given out that
Yeah.
we don't need to go into. But I think a lot of people felt like they were more at risk than maybe they were.
Yes.
And so, like for me being a grandparent, I heard these stories of grandparents isolating from their grandchildren. I thought that is really sad. We
Hmm.
never did that. We created what we called our pod.
Hmm.
And so we had our group, our extended family, and we made sure everybody was being wise. And so we never quit with our family interactions at all. Whereas I remember, that first Thanksgiving, a lot of people were saying, don't travel for Thanksgiving, don't have extended family for Thanksgiving. We never did that.
Oh, okay. And so, I mean, my experience, I more or less did the same thing. We still went to stores, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we still did shopping. We didn't completely isolate, but it was still so hard for me because I lost a lot of social connections. I wasn't going to church anymore. And that was really hard because I got a
Right.
lot of
Right.
socialization from church,
Yeah.
right? And then, I had friends that I would regularly get together with in fact, this friend that I mentioned that lives in Utah that I'm still really close with, we would get together once a week, every week for almost the entire 5 years that I was in Utah. We were getting
Mm.
together one day every week and just spending almost the entire day together with our kids, letting our kids play. We would hang out, and losing that was hard for me. And so one coping method that we did find is we would go to an empty parking lot and we would talk in our cars, right? So we would
Oh,
meet
okay.
for and that kind of became a thing. It was, because
Yeah.
you're outside and so it's less risky and you're just kind of talking to each other, from a distance through your cars, right? And so we would do that a little bit. But I mean, overall, like it was hard. And then moving to Indiana was even harder. I mean, I explain it as I gave up my blossoming mom social life and moved to a cornfield in the middle of Indiana, right? I mean, and because my mother-in-law, she lives right across the street from this big cornfield, but
Uh-huh.
she lives in a really, really small town.
Yeah.
And so, it was even further isolating. And I mean, mentally and emotionally, it was really, really tough for me. I mean, when we finally started going out, I think going out and seeing people again, I mean, I was like, people, yay, people again. I was just so
Yeah.
excited to go see people. And yes, I still maintained my connections. Like I still talked to family, right? And I
Mhm.
even lived with my mother-in-law, which I guess didn't make me necessarily isolated, but I still felt really isolated.
Yeah.
It was just hard for me.
So if we look at the different situations, because you mentioned that, isolation is going to look different depending on your situation. And so I think that here's some different ways that people can be isolated. If you're unemployed, then often
Mm.
you become isolated. And I think often that has to do with, say, the shame of being unemployed. And you don't want to, because often if we go out and we meet friends, the first thing they're going to say, oh, what do you do? Or how's work going? And I think it's very hard to say, well, I got laid off or I'm unemployed. And so
Yeah.
for a lot of people, they just avoid that
Mhm.
by staying isolated. I think physical impairments, so if
Mm.
you have some sort of physical disability that limits your mobility, then it's going to be much harder to get out. And that will create, the sense of isolation. Remote location, which we talked about, some people live or work in remote areas. Mental
Mhm.
health issues,
Yeah.
anxiety, depression, social anxiety, certainly agoraphobia, prevent people from. So what a lot of people, I think, forget is that the person who's isolating typically doesn't want to be
Yeah.
isolated. And, it's just that there are other things that are either mental health or physical or situational that are preventing them from getting out. Often a loss of a loved one, we become isolated because of grief. We've done an episode on grief in the past. And I think often the way we deal with grief is to isolate because we feel like no one can understand what it is I'm experiencing. So we pull in. Then even if you're in a domestic violence situation,
Yes.
certainly with, typically statistically, it's going to be the female is going to be the one who's have violence towards, and that can be isolating. And if you've got bruises, or again, if you go out and someone says, "Oh, what happened to you?" that is either shameful or hard, or you're afraid of any number of reasons, and so you tend to isolate. So I think all of those are different cases of isolation that are going to look different, but I think the common theme is that you really don't want to be isolated, and that's kind of the defining feature. When I mentioned loneliness before, one of the big differences, loneliness is more of a subjective feeling.
Yeah.
Like I feel lonely. And so that's why you can feel lonely in a crowd of people. You can feel lonely alone, when you are isolated. But the isolation we're talking about is, I think it's isolation where we aren't making the choice to be isolated. The one that I didn't mention that I don't know if is somewhat controversial, I think our listeners will know and remember that I have a somewhat negative attitude towards social media.
Mm-hmm.
And I hear a lot of people say that social media helps you connect.
Yep.
Which I think is true to a certain extent. So, for instance, if you're older and can't get out, then I think it's really important that you do whatever you can to connect. And that's, in a lot of ways, it's going to be through social media. But if you're, say, a young adult or a teenager and you're using social media, you're really missing out on some important developmental, skills that you can learn. And I think that can be isolating. And I believe often they don't realize what's going on. That if possible, and I know this is in ideal situations, if possible, I think it's better to do face-to-face connection, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like you probably felt with your friend, even though you're in a car. That felt a little weird. I would guess that you're in a
Yeah.
car sitting in the parking lot because you
Mm-hmm.
can't be as free
Yep.
and as open. It just feels different. Well,
Yes.
can you imagine if my only connection is through some social media app or texting?
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of people think they have connection, and there is a connection to a point, but it's different than face to face. It's very different than what we get in person. And so I think social media can be isolating.
Oh, it absolutely can. And study after study has shown that your mental health will be better if you limit your social media use. Now, I understand there are certainly people who use social media platforms in their business, right?
Uh-huh.
And so
Right.
I want to emphasize that's different, right? I'm talking about just mindlessly using social media, or if you're using it for entertainment, or if it's your only form of connection with people and you have the ability to go out and connect with people and you're choosing social media instead. That is a serious problem, especially for adolescents,
Mm-hmm.
because honestly, I don't think I don't know that any adolescents should really be on social media. And keep in mind, my oldest is only 10. So we
Yeah.
haven't really crossed that bridge yet. We haven't really come to a decision on that. But my 10-year-old is absolutely not allowed to have her own Facebook or any sort of account, right?
Well, that I agree with that. And I don't know if you follow what happened in the Utah legislature, and I think it's happening in other places, is they put some restrictions on adolescents and social media. And I
Yeah.
think we're one of the first states to do that. And I really agree with that. And so, just for information for our listeners, if you're a parent, I think every parent should sit down and watch it's a Netflix documentary called The Social Dilemma.
Okay.
And I think it's really important for parents to see. I think if you have adolescents, I think they could see it as well. to see the negative influence and what it can do. I think it's really an important documentary.
So I kind of, I guess I kind of grew up in some ways you might call it a golden age where, I grew up right at the boom of technology. So
Mm-hmm.
cell phones weren't really prevalent. They weren't nearly as prevalent as they are now when I was, say, in middle school. When I was in middle school, not very many kids had cell phones. Very few middle schoolers had a cell phone that they kept with them. In fact, we weren't allowed to. And by the time I got into high school, I think almost everybody in high school had a cell phone. And so, I kind of grew up in this age where I learned both. I kind of got the best of both worlds. I grew up social media and not completely technology free, but social media wasn't a thing when I was in elementary school. I mean, I think MySpace has started to come along and I didn't do that. And then, I got in on Facebook when I was, I think, like a freshman in high school. And so I feel like I had the best of both worlds is because I learned that aspect of social media. And I don't want parents to think we're just completely saying no social media ever, because there are some good things. And you have to keep in mind that one way or another, your kids are going to get on social media. They will
Right.
find a way.
That's
And
true.
and I'm a firm believer of doing it in a controlled environment as much as you
Mm-hmm.
can. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, I think you're better off just you yourself introducing your kid to social media and say, you're going to have this account, but I have access to it. So,
Right.
and we've done other episodes on that before, but I think the point I'm trying to make is I was able to learn and develop social skills,
Yeah.
interpersonal social skills. And I think that's what so many youth today are losing. And it can be very isolating is they don't know how to connect in person because they're so used to connecting online.
Yeah. See, that's how it all fits together.
Yeah.
I agree with you. If you don't learn the skills now, then when you're 30 years old,
Yeah.
you don't have those skills to make the connections, and then you're lonely or you're isolated. I think it's really problematic. So, yeah, I think listeners may, I think if they've heard us before, they know that we have, somewhat a negative attitude towards social media. But as we've said before, it's just like a drug. The artificial intelligence that they use, the only goal is to get you addicted. That's it. To
Yeah.
keep you scrolling. That's the
Yep.
addiction. And your brain looks just like you're on a drug. So it's isolating. But I think you bring up a really good point that, you know, for an adolescent, you aren't thinking about what are you going to be like when you're 30 or 35.
Yep.
But that lack of social skill will definitely negatively impact your life when you're
Yeah.
older.
Yeah, it will. And so I don't have as negative an opinion of social media as you do.
Yeah.
But, it is so important for kids to learn in-person social interaction, right?
Yeah.
And now, obviously, they're going to get that in school. They're going to be forced to do it in school. But I think they also need to learn to do it outside of a school setting because the school setting is very controlled. So you may be a high schooler or a junior high student, and you're getting this forced interaction at school, but then you come home and you spend all your time isolated. Your only social interaction is in a controlled setting. That's not good developmentally. Your
Yeah.
kids, you need to do your best to try to get your kids out there and socializing in an uncontrolled setting. I
Yeah.
mean, one of the great things I've loved about the last few neighborhoods that I've lived in is summers, the kids just spend them roaming the neighborhood, right?
Hmm.
Or outside with other kids. Don't lose that to technology.
Yeah.
Parents, do not give that up.
Yeah. So I think as we're talking about the different types of isolation, I think there are groups of people who are more prone to it. So we've talked about older adults.
Hmm.
I think that can be limiting in a lot of when they live alone, family might not be near. Often with older adults, there are mobility issues
Yep.
that prevent them from going out. And so, in that case, like hearing loss, vision loss, that
Hmm.
can be really isolating. Some interesting work on hearing loss that if you don't treat it with hearing aids, that it increases the likelihood of dementia. That
Oh, really?
it actually harms your brain. And what they're thinking is that your brain is so hard is working so hard to try and figure out what's going on. And then the isolation itself is hard on your brain.
Hmm.
And that's not true because I have my hearing aids in. If you treat it, say with hearing aids, and it's fine. But
Mhm.
so older adults, and going back to the social media, I think that is really important for adults to be able to connect with other people in
Mhm.
that way. Immigrants, so language,
Yeah.
I think, can often lead to social isolation,
So,
having, economic challenges. Immigrants
yeah.
often have economic challenges. Yeah.
And they live with the possible fear
Hmm.
of deportation,
Right. Right.
if
If
you feel
they're
like
if
you're,
they're undocumented, yeah.
yeah, then I mean you're living in constant fear and you're worried, who can I trust? Who can I talk to? Who can I open up to?
Mhm.
Right? And so that certainly can be very isolating and lonely. So before we wrap up, I want to get into work from home jobs and
Mhm.
isolation because, honestly, I can say that's, from my perspective, that's probably one good thing that came out of this pandemic is how prevalent work from home jobs are, right? And so people have figured out that, hey, we can do this. And maybe not for everybody, but in a lot of ways, I think that's kind of become a positive thing because there are a lot of benefit to working from home, but there can be drawbacks, and you need to be aware of the isolation. If you are single and living on your own or living with just a roommate, that may not count as enough socialization.
Right. And so I have a client who's an older adult, my age, and he's an attorney, and he's worked from home and still does because a lot of work, like you point out,
Hmm.
can actually be done at home.
Yeah.
And there's really no difference in if you're sitting in, say, a home office or sitting in some fancy office in the middle of town, you're doing the same thing.
Yep.
But he became isolated, really socially isolated. And it's hard to get back into the office, even though they have opened up his office.
Hmm.
I don't know, it's probably been open for a year, but a lot of people stay away because it's just easier,
Yeah.
right? But the problem is you don't have that connection. And that's what he found is you don't have the connection day to day. And so for a lot of us, a lot of our connection is about seeing clients in person or seeing our colleagues in
Yes.
person. I see people all the time who still work from home and they're having Zoom meetings all day long.
Yep. Yep.
It doesn't feel the same to them.
No, well, it's not the same. I
And
mean,
it's not the
Curtis,
same.
yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, Curtis can vouch for that, I mean, because he's worked from home for 5 years now, I mean, since before the pandemic. And since he switched to this newer job, I mean, I don't know how that man gets anything done because I swear he spends like 60% of his workday on Zoom meeting. And so, yeah, he would agree. A Zoom meeting is not the same and even Zoom meetings with clients or coworkers, it's not the same as physically being in person. Like he still wants to go out and be social with, human
Yeah.
beings that aren't on a screen.
Yeah. So for a lot of people who ended up working from home, here's the dilemma. The
Hmm.
dilemma is it's easier
Yep.
and you can get in many jobs, you can get the same amount of work done,
Oh yeah.
but you're isolated. And so the negative effects of the isolation and where's the trade-off? Now, what some people are doing is they're kind of doing a hybrid is I'll go into the office 3 days a week and I'll
Yep.
stay at home 2 days a week, which seems like a pretty good compromise to me because then you get, kind of the best of both worlds. I have heard of some firms. So you get both sides with the management of firms. One say get back into the office, and the others are saying, well, we can save a lot of money. We're just going to give up our office
Yep.
and everybody's going to work from home. And so I don't know that there's a right or a wrong, except that you've got to figure out a way to not be so isolated. And so if you're in a situation, say, where you are isolated, but you don't want to be, then I think you have to pay attention to that and maybe do some, other things like, some sort of meditation or relaxation. I think if you're home and isolated, following a routine, structure, what we often get, one of the important things we get from going into an office is structure.
Yes.
When you're home, you don't have that same structure.
Hmm.
And so you can change the way you feel about it. It doesn't really necessarily make the isolation any less, but I think it makes it easier that if you create a structure, maintaining healthy habits, which I think is just the same as having a structure. And then in that case, I would use social media as a way to stay connected.
Mm-hmm.
It's better than not being connected.
Yes.
I think the other thing you can do is stay informed, because for some people, what they do is they shut themselves off from the world, and the world is still going on out there.
Mm-hmm.
And so, staying informed, being connected, that's in the case where you really can't change it. But I'd strongly suggest, like, if you have the opportunity, say, to do a hybrid, go into the office some days, stay at home some days. You get the best of both worlds.
Right. And so not everyone does have that option, though. Curtis,
No, you're
certainly
right.
in either job. I mean, in his first job, it was based out of Atlanta, Georgia, and his current job is based out of Bellevue, Washington. So he really doesn't have that option. And so I think in those instances, community is going to be really important.
Yes. Yeah.
Find some sort of community. And some people, it might be religion, it might be church. There's also all sorts of other social groups. So, Curtis and I have loved getting into the biking community. And so our local bike shop, every Thursday, they sponsor this casual ride. I don't know if they sponsor it, but they do just a casual ride.
Yeah.
Yeah. They organize it. And so, and we've really enjoyed that, because we get to go out and meet different people, and, it's a community. Right. Yeah. And so if that is an option for you, I mean, and for some people, I realize it's not. And then I think social media, again, is better than nothing. But, if you really are stuck at home, find a community to be a part of. And I can't think of very many communities that are exclusive and are not willing to accept new members. Most communities are like, oh, yeah, come be a part of this. So it can be a hobby. It can be a skill you want to learn. And again, social media can be a great place to find that. So the
takeaway, I think, from today is isolation, if you aren't choosing to be isolated, can be detrimental to both your mental and your physical health. And you should figure out a way to try and change that in some way, or at least take care of yourself in a way if you have to be isolated, and then it's hard, and not often people don't have that choice, but you need to do something about it. Yeah. You can't, if you just let it go and be isolated, it's just too detrimental.
And you brought this up at the beginning of the episode. The longer you go, the harder it is to unisolate. So, I mean, because eventually you kind of get comfortable in your isolation. And while you may be comfortable in some aspects, that doesn't just diminish your need for connection.
Right. And the way I frame that is, people are familiar. So I am familiar with my isolation. I may be uncomfortable in it, but being familiar is more important. Yeah.
And well, that's not necessarily healthy.
No, it's not. It's easier. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, but I mean, easier isn't always better.
No, it's not. It's not at all.
Yeah.
I think sometimes we have to make those hard choices.
Yeah. Sometimes you just have to force yourself into uncomfortable situations. It's hard at first, but overall it's going to be better for you.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. So next week, we're going to get into uncomfortable emotions. So stay tuned to hear more of what that's about, and we will see you all next week.
Have a good week, everyone.
Have a question for Dr. Burton? How about a topic you'd like us to cover? Send us an email at mentalhealthpod21@gmail.com. This podcast was produced and edited by Liz Lang. Music is by Audio Lounge.